For the macronutrients module, several experiments are demonstrated to help determine the presence of carbohydrates, proteins, and lipids. The first three experiments focus on carbohydrates. The three classes of carbohydrates include monosaccharides, mono meaning one, disaccharides, di meaning two, and polysaccharides, poly meaning many. The prefixes describe the carbohydrate's molecular structure. The Benedict's test for reducing sugars experiment focuses mainly on monosaccharides. When testing monosaccharide solutions in the Benedict's test, all monosaccharides will test positive for reducing sugars. Only some disaccharides are reducing sugars, and none of the polysaccharides is a reducing sugar. Why are they called reducing sugars? Because they can accept a hydrogen or an oxygen from a metal, thus reducing that metal. In this experiment, reducing sugars accept an oxygen from the copper found in Benedict's reagent. So the copper starts out oxidized and then becomes reduced. Think about oxidized copper, which has bluish colors associated with it. Yet copper pennies, which are not oxidized, remain in tones of browns, reds, and oranges. These are the colors that would positively identify the samples as reducing sugars. If the sample remains the blue color of the Benedict's reagent, then that's considered a negative result. Please note that this experiment should be immediately followed by the hydrolysis experiment. There are some thought questions in the hydrolysis section that need to be answered prior to exploring the next experiment.
We're now going to begin the Benedict's test. The materials have already been added to the test tubes. The test tubes are labeled 1 through 7. In test tube 1, we have 2 milliliters of distilled water. In test tube 2, we have 2 milliliters of glucose. Test tube 3 has fructose. Test tube 4, sucrose. Test tube 5 is cellulose paper. Test tube 6 is starch. And test tube 7 is milk. Now that our materials have been added, I'm going to add 3 milliliters of Benedict's reagent to each test tube. Now that the reagent is all added, I'm going to give them each a gentle stir to give them a little mix. Our water bath is at a nice roaring boil or rolling boil, and we can put our test tubes into the bath. We don't need to use the test tube clamps when we place them into the bath, because the test tubes are cold. When we go to remove the test tubes, it will be important for us to use the test tube clamps. What I'll do is I'll depress the sides to open the clamps. I will carefully relax my grip, and once the test tube is in place with the clamps, I can use it to move. You may have seen that some of the test tubes began to change immediately. The tubes should be heated for a full 2 minutes. We have completed our boil for the full 2 minutes, and now we can remove them using the test tube clamps and place them back into the test tube rack very carefully. The test tube rack has small divots that the test tubes can sit into. So it's important that we make sure that the test tube rests in that divot before we release the clamps. Now that you have the results, go ahead and record them in your table.